New Protocol, Overprotective Irondad by AmaraCaos. Since the end of the Civil War, and especially since what happened in Homecoming, Peter's life had only gotten better. Tony stopped ignoring him and decided to offer Peter an internship instead of leaving everything related to him in Happy's hands. At first, the internship was only a couple of hours every 2 weeks, during which Peter would go to the tower and tell Tony how his patrols had gone. But when Peter showed interest in the lab, Tony decided to teach him a few things. Tony quickly noticed Peter's intellect, so what started out as just a quick explanation of concepts turned into several afternoons a week where Peter spent time tinkering with Tony in the lab. May was very happy that her nephew was getting real first-hand experience, so when Peter fell asleep at the lab table one Friday afternoon, Tony called May to see if the boy could stay over. The guest room where Peter slept that first night soon became his room, so much so that by the time Peter started staying over on weekends, Tony painted it blue and decorated it with Iron Man posters. Peter was a little sulky about the childish decor, but he didn't take any of them down. 3 months after the internship began, Peter could no longer call it an internship. Now, Peter went to the tower 2 afternoons a week and stayed over 2 weekends a month, in addition to every night that Aunt May had the night shift at the hospital. Peter met Rhodey and Pepper when Tony introduced them at a Wednesday dinner when his aunt was on an afternoon shift. The two immediately took a liking to Peter, causing Peter to have to divide his time between Tony's lab days, training with Rhodey, and business management classes with Pepper. Peter wasn't quite sure why Pepper wanted to teach him how to run SI, but he loved spending time with her, so he wasn't going to complain. On Friday afternoons, the 4 of them would have movie marathons, always age-appropriate for Peter, and chat until they fell asleep. Peter had gone from not talking to Tony to, calling him Tony. The man had been so persistent about it that Peter finally gave in. But now, Peter was going to be alone this weekend. Aunt May had a convention in Chicago, so, as usual, Peter was going to ask Tony if he could stay with him. When Happy picked Peter up from school on Thursday, Peter ran up to the attic. As soon as he reached the right floor, Peter trotted in and threw his school bag on the floor as he approached Tony, who was at the kitchen island making a sandwich for his protégé. Seeing Peter throw his bag on the floor, Tony frowned. "Haven't you lost about 7 of those this month already? Pick it up and take it to your room before you come and eat something," Tony ordered, as he continued to spread peanut butter on the sandwich. Peter rolled his eyes as he went back for his backpack and did as Tony told him. Of course, Peter couldn't resist shouting a sarcastic, "Yes, Dad," as he walked away down the hallway. Returning to the kitchen, Peter could see Tony smiling amusedly at the phrase. That was a new development. Peter had started calling Tony Dad whenever he behaved like a strict or overprotective father. But they weren't fooling anyone. They both loved their new relationship. Sitting down on one of the kitchen stools, Peter let Tony ruffle his hair as he handed him the prepared sandwich, crusts removed just like Peter liked it, and a Capri Sun. While Peter was eating, Pepper came out of one of the rooms, fully dressed, talking on the phone, while holding a huge stack of papers in her arms. She laughed subtly when she saw Peter's crustless sandwich and kissed him on the head as she left the attic, still talking on the phone. Tony grumbled a little when he saw his fiancée kiss Peter and not him, to which Peter stuck out his tongue, covered in butter and bread. "That's disgusting," Tony said to Peter, wrinkling his nose playfully. "Finish your sandwich, Bambino. I have a meeting in Tokyo tomorrow, so we'll have to hurry up with the new Stark phone model today if we don't want to fall behind." Peter swallowed the rest of his sandwich, frowning slightly. "Are you leaving tomorrow?" he asked, thinking about how he had planned to stay here and sleep over this weekend. Tony nodded at Peter's question. "Yes, Bambino. Pepper, Rhodey and I have a conference in Tokyo to launch the new prosthetics. Honey Bear is going to be our model," Tony said, laughing a little at his best friend's future suffering. Peter just let out a small, "Oh," as he thought about having to stay alone this weekend. Of course, Tony noticed his pseudo-son's concern. "What's up, Bambino? That's your slightly concerned face," Tony asked. Peter shrugged. "May has this conference in Chicago this weekend, so I was going to ask if I could stay over," said Peter, trying to downplay the matter. Tony gave him an understanding and somewhat sad look at the news that his son was going to be alone. But Tony couldn't take him to Tokyo. They wouldn't be back until Tuesday, and Peter couldn't afford to miss any more classes after all his absences as Spider-Man. Tony thought for a minute. Happy wouldn't be there because he was going with them to Tokyo, but he didn't see why Peter couldn't stay alone in the tower. Friday controlled the tower, so Peter would be safer here than in Queens, and Peter already had free access, so he could come here after school and stay for the weekend. No access to the lab, of course. Tony knew Parker's luck wasn't going to leave this teenage genius alone in the lab unsupervised, spider sense or not. "Why don't you stay this weekend? Friday can keep you company," Tony said to Peter in an attempt to cheer him up. Peter, upon hearing the news, quickly raised his head with a big smile. "Really? Thank you, thank you, thank you," Peter said before throwing himself into an embrace with his mentor father. Tony was a little surprised, but quickly hugged his protégé son. "All right, Bambino, let's go to the lab. Those adjustments aren't going to make themselves," Tony exclaimed, before dragging Peter to the lift. The next day, Peter couldn't resist telling Ned the news. "Mate, are you really going to stay in Stark Tower all by yourself? I wish I were you," Ned exclaimed enthusiastically. Peter knew that his friend was as much of a geek as he was about the Avengers and Stark Industries, so he couldn't resist telling him the news. Of course, Flash couldn't resist commenting either. "Are you talking about your fake internship again, Parker? For God's sake, you couldn't be more desperate for attention," Flash shouted in the middle of the hallway to embarrass Peter. There were a few thinly veiled laughs, but most of those present ignored Flash and focused on their own business. Ned was going to defend his friend, but Peter quickly covered his mouth and dragged him to class before the bell rang. When the classes ended, Peter was jumping up and down in his seat with excitement. Normally Happy would pick him up, but as he was the head of security, he was going to accompany Tony, Pepper and Rhodey on the trip, so Peter would have to take the tube. So, the moment the bell rang, Peter carelessly stuffed his books into his backpack and ran out of the classroom, but not before saying goodbye to Ned. "Bye, Ned, see you on Monday," whispered Peter as he got up from his seat and headed for the door. "Tell me how it went on Monday," Ned shouted as Peter walked out the door. Flash must have made some sarcastic comment, but Peter couldn't hear him anymore. He had used some of his super speed to leave the school before the hallways filled up, so he could catch the tube earlier. The tube was as crowded as ever, but the distance between Midtown and the tower was quite long, so unless Peter put on his suit and swung to the tower, this was the fastest method of transport if Peter didn't want to attract attention. The good thing about this half-hour journey was that Peter could start planning what he would do this weekend at the tower. Tony had left food in the fridge for him, fearing Peter's non-existent cooking skills, and had also told him that he was strictly forbidden from entering the laboratory. Peter, of course, had protested, but when Tony reminded him of the series of chemical explosions Peter had caused while developing the web bomb, he had no choice but to shut up. Of course, that didn't mean Peter had nothing to do for these 3 days. The laboratory doors were locked, and Friday would make sure Peter didn't get in anyway, but he had a latest generation Stark pad in his room, connected to a holographic screen, perfect for designing, or, as Peter planned to do, programming. Peter hadn't mentioned it to Tony, but when he started spending more time in the attic, Karen connected to the tower's network, which allowed her to communicate with Peter in the same way as Friday, through the sensors and speakers in the ceiling, without Peter having to wear the suit. Since then, Friday and Karen had become quite friendly, sharing information servers and spaces, which inevitably led them to join forces in certain aspects. Now, every time he entered the tower, Karen would switch from his suit and phone to the tower's servers, talking to Peter and opening doors for him, without having to ask Friday or Tony for permission. That also led to a certain discovery Peter had made 3 weeks ago. Peter could access Friday's servers through Karen. At first, Peter didn't know what to do with so much access, so he didn't touch it. But last week, when Tony was working on his suit and Peter was working on his web shooter blueprints, he decided to check the files for the Mark 43 Tony was working on to see if he could find the error. Peter put his web shooters aside and logged into Friday's servers, where he found the correct blueprints, and although he couldn't find the problem, Peter found something much more interesting: the activation codes and remote piloting commands for the nearly 50 Iron Man suits. He knew Tony would be angry if Peter didn't tell him about the security breach, but it wasn't as if Peter was going to fly the suits irresponsibly, so he kept quiet for the time being, in case there was an emergency and he needed extra help. So, as Peter exited the underground and headed for the tower, he began mentally designing the protection protocols he could introduce to Karen for his safety. With Karen, getting through the reception was a breeze. Peter rarely entered through the front door, since there was a lift in the garage where Happy parked the car, but on the few occasions he didn't have to go through security. Today, Peter did the same. He walked through the main door into the SI lobby. There were quite a few people, including visitors, receptionists, and security personnel, but Peter didn't bother to look at anyone. He just kept walking towards the security checkpoint. The light indicating that Friday was monitoring changed from a red and gold to red and blue, a subtle change that no one noticed except Peter, indicating that Karen had logged into the system. One of the empty, switched-off monitors lit up, causing a couple of security guards to look over, but when they saw Peter walk past, they simply looked away and went about their business. Peter didn't know if Happy had said anything to them, but he didn't bother to ask as he headed for the staff lift. As Peter stood waiting for the lift, a lady approached him with a worried look on her face. "Excuse me." But her words were cut off when the lift doors opened in front of Peter. Peter turned around. "Did you want something?" The lady simply shook her head, saying, "No, nothing," and quickly walked away. Peter shrugged and got into the lift. He didn't even have to say anything for Karen to take him up to the attic. When he arrived, Peter stopped himself from throwing his backpack on the floor as he usually did, and took it to his room. Tony wasn't there to scold him, but Peter wouldn't be surprised if he checked Friday's cameras and sent him an audio message telling him off. After putting everything away, Peter went to the kitchen, took out a super soldier-sized portion of lasagna out of the fridge, and heated it up in the microwave. Tony had cooked it himself, so Peter knew it was going to be delicious. When he finished eating, Peter washed and put away the dishes and ran to his room. He had a lot to do, and with Karen's help he could probably finish it by that afternoon. His homework was already done, since Peter had finished it between classes, so he immediately sat down at his desk and activated the hologram casting on his Stark pad. "Karen, show me Friday's protection protocols and the Mark's control systems," Peter requested as soon as he sat down. "Sure, Peter," the AI replied immediately. "But I remind you that you do not have permission to delete any existing protocols," the AI pointed out. Peter smiled somewhat sheepishly, remembering how he and Ned had deactivated the training wheels protocol months ago. "I know, Karen, but I can add protocols, right?" Peter asked, giving Karen's cameras puppy dog eyes. Peter didn't know if emotional blackmail would work on an AI, but it couldn't hurt to try. With a sigh that was a little more human than expected, Karen replied, "Yes, Peter, you can add whatever you want." Peter gave a victory sign and began coding. By mid-afternoon, Peter had added several emergency protocols, not just for himself, but for Tony, Pepper, Rhodey, Happy, and May. In case of danger, several suits would take off and fight the threat, or take everyone to a safe place. Of course, each protocol had a silly name, such as Tin Can Protection, or Saving Our Queen. Peter was very proud of his work. Although when Tony found out, he might get a good telling off. Still, the protocol Peter was most proud of was the Overprotective Irondad protocol. Peter wasn't afraid of being alone. He was Spider-Man after all. But if the tower was attacked while he was alone inside, he might not be able to protect it. So he created a protocol to deploy all of Tony's suits available in the tower to attack the intruders. The name was because, if Tony believed he did it to defend himself and not the tower, the punishment would be less severe. Peter didn't have much hope for that, but what he certainly didn't count on was having to use the protocol so soon. At 10 o'clock at night, Peter took some barbecue pizza out of the fridge and turned on the TV in the living room. The pizza had been in the fridge for 2 days, so Peter quickly devoured it along with another piece of lasagna. There was nothing particularly appealing on television, just some cooking shows and old episodes of classic comedies that Peter had already seen 1,000 times. So Peter decided to watch something on Netflix, since Tony had bought it for him. The Company. Peter never thought he would have to specify that he only wanted an account. Peter was too lazy to reach for the remote, and his suit and web shooters were in the lab. Tony didn't want him to be Spider-Man when no adults who knew about Peter's second identity were in town, so he kept the suit where he knew Peter couldn't reach it. So he simply asked Friday, "Friday, can you please put Brooklyn Nine-Nine on Netflix?" Peter asked the ceiling. Friday remained silent, which made Peter's stomach sink with worry. Friday was never silenced, for obvious security reasons, so if she wasn't talking, it meant someone had disconnected her, which meant the tower was under attack. Thinking quickly, Peter grabbed his phone and tried to contact Karen. He had instructed his AI to set up the new protocols on his phone, so Karen wasn't on Friday's servers when Friday was shut down. "Karen, what's going on?" Peter asked his phone AI, trying not to panic. This time Karen did answer. "I'm going to run a diagnostic on Friday's servers, Peter. Stay where you are." With that, Karen's voice went silent again. Peter would be lying to himself if he wasn't feeling a little nervous, maybe even scared. Unable to bear the silence, Peter picked up his mobile phone again and tried to call Tony. There was no dial tone. Whoever had infiltrated the tower and shut down Friday had knocked out communications. Peter hadn't realised because the television was still working, but the tower's ultra-powerful Wi-Fi wasn't working either, even though it was still showing on his screen. Peter jumped in his seat when he heard Karen's voice coming from the speakers in the attic. 30 armed men have entered the tower and knocked out all the signals and Friday. I've managed to connect all the cameras without them noticing, but they're on their way to the arc reactor and Mr. Stark's personal storage room. I recommend activating Overprotective Irondad protocol. As she said this, Karen had broadcast the image from the tower's security cameras on the screen. Peter was thankful that no one was in the tower today, because several armed groups of what appeared to be highly trained thieves had just passed through the lobby and were methodically heading to all the places where new technology was stored. Peter had thought of calling the police, but with communications down, it wasn't going to be easy to get help, so Peter followed Karen's advice, but with a few modifications. "Alright, Karen, activate the Overprotective Irondad protocol. I also want you to broadcast the name of the protocol at full volume. Let everyone know that we are under attack. Also, display something on the holographic screen on the windows of floors 22 to 55. Hopefully someone will call the police, or Tony will hear the news," Peter ordered quickly. Karen didn't even bother to respond, but immediately carried out Peter's orders and sounded the alarms. Several floors below, a group of thieves moved quickly through the corridors in search of Stark's new technological materials. One of them, the most paranoid, asked his partner, "Are you sure you deactivated that AI properly? The cameras are still lit up in red and blue," said the thief, gripping his weapon even tighter and clenching his jaw. His partner rolled his eyes. "I didn't turn off any lights not to arouse suspicion, but everything is deactivated, don't worry," he repeated for the 5th time. The first thief was about to say something, but quickly shut his mouth when massive alarms began to sound. "Alert! Danger! Alert! Danger! Intruders detected in the tower! Activating protocol! Overprotective Irondad! Mission: eliminate the threat and protect Spider Baby!" The thieves dropped their weapons and covered their ears at the deafening volume of the alarm. Even so, one of them managed to shout, "You said you deactivated the AI, so what is this?" The other thief could only shout, "I don't know," as he curled up further, trying to block out the horrible sound. Suddenly, all the lights in the tower changed from white to red and blue, and on every computer and electronic device the thieves could see, the Spider-Man logo appeared on each screen. The thieves, who had managed to compose themselves a little, quickly picked up their weapons from the floor and started running towards the entrance, But they didn't get far, as a group of Iron Man suits stopped them. One of the newer models was the one that got closest to the thieves, with both thrusters aimed at the group, and declared in a metallic voice, "Target located. Thieves. Mission: stop the threat and protect Spider Baby." The thieves, knowing they were screwed, simply laid their weapons on the ground, knelt down and put their hands up in surrender. Peter, who had gotten Karen to hack into the lab's entrance so he could get his suit, had made his way down to the floor where the thieves had been contained by the Iron Man suits. The men only glanced at him out of the corner of their eyes, much more concerned with the high-tech suits that were literally pointing lasers at their faces than with a young vigilante. Peter didn't even bother to feel offended by this, so he just shot a few webs to collect the weapons lying on the floor. The suits wouldn't shoot him, but his spider sense was warning him that if he got too close, one of these idiots would try to use him as a human shield against the suits. Once he had secured the weapons, he wrapped them in an extra strong web, and did the same with the thieves, one by one, like burritos wrapped in an ultra-sticky napkin. By the time he was done with all 30, Peter could already hear police sirens approaching the tower entrance. Peter wasn't quite sure how the police would receive him, knowing that being a vigilante was illegal and all that, but he had nothing to worry about. When the officers saw the 30 masked men tied up and being guarded by more than 10 Iron Man suits, they immediately lowered their weapons and approached Peter cautiously. "Are these the intruders Stark's alarm was screaming about?" asked the man who appeared to be the commanding officer. Peter nodded vigorously. "Yep, 30 thieves tied up and counted. They ruined my dinner," Peter joked as he handed the chief the web he had used to tie them up. The superintendent seemed puzzled by Peter, but made no comment and simply turned to leave. "Our work is done, lads. Get them in the patrol cars and let's go," the man shouted before getting into the car, along with the thieves and the rest of the police, and driving away. Peter sent the suits to the hangar where they were stored and went to bed. It would take Karen a while to restore communications, so Peter could rest for a while. The next morning, Peter woke up to Karen's voice. "Peter, Mr. Stark is calling you," his AI announced. Peter grumbled a little in his sleep, but as he processed the words, he got up and answered the phone. The first thing he heard was Tony. "Peter, are you okay? Are you hurt? I saw what happened on the news as soon as I arrived in Tokyo. Friday couldn't contact you. How did the suits protect the tower? Have you seen the news?" Tony began asking frantically. Peter was still half asleep, so the only thing that came out of his mouth in response to Tony's anxiety was a heartfelt, Tony seemed exasperated by his intern's slowness, so he resigned himself to waiting for Peter to wake up slowly, or to do something more shocking. Of course, he was Tony Stark. He didn't wait. "Friday, show Peter the news," Tony demanded over the phone. The AI heard him perfectly, because in the next instant it declared, "Putting on the news," and the holographic screen unfolded right in front of Peter's nose. Peter immediately recognised the tower in the background behind the reporter. It was the tower where he was sleeping. Focusing, Peter listened to the news. "Stark Tower, which was attacked yesterday by an armed group of no more than 30 criminals who managed to enter the premises with the intention of stealing valuable assets from Stark Industries. Fortunately, one of the protocols was activated. The surprise, the name of the protocol, Overprotective Irondad, was the name of the security protocol that caused all known Iron Man suits to come out and stop the robbery," explained the news reporter. Peter hadn't thought through the media repercussions of the whole thing. He just got scared, and since he couldn't call the police, he used the protocol he installed half-jokingly. But the reporter continued, broadcasting images of the alarm and of the large Spider-Man symbol reflected in all the windows of the Stark Tower. "And as we all heard yesterday, the immediate mission of the suits was not to stop the intruders, but to protect Spider Baby, whom we all suspected is the vigilante known as Spider-Man. This was confirmed later when Spider-Man himself handed criminals over to the police," the reporter continued. In the following images, Peter could be seen leaving the tower with the iron suits as very protective bodyguards, accompanied by the tied-up criminals. The image changed to the officer Peter had spoken to yesterday, who, it seemed, had given an interview to the press a few hours earlier. "Yes, the suits were definitely protecting him. He also told me that the thieves had ruined his dinner and then went back inside the tower. I'm pretty sure he was at least having dinner inside Stark Industries, said the Chief Commissioner as he scratched his head. The image changed back to the reporter. You've heard it. Extreme protection protocols, essential mission to protect him and stay at the Stark Tower. If Tony Stark's security systems are to be believed, the man has a son, and that son is Spider-Man, he told the reporter, smiling at the camera. Peter quickly turned off the television and returned to the phone with Tony, who was impatiently waiting for Peter to finish watching the news. Well, what happened? Tony asked. And Peter told him everything. Peter's access to Friday's servers thanks to Karen, the installation of security protocols, Peter's near theft of Tony's suits, the stupid names of the protocols, the deactivation of Friday and the actual theft, Karen's takeover and activation of the suits and alarms to attract the attention of the police, and finally, the capture and delivery of the criminals to the police. Tony was silent for a minute before sighing. Well, that could have been a lot worse. At least you didn't take on 30 armed men by yourself, Tony said, giving thanks for small mercies. Peter hadn't even thought about taking them on by himself. Are you angry? Peter asked in a weak voice. Tony looked at his protege and smiled reassuringly. Of course not, Bambino. I would have liked you to tell me about your access to Friday and your new protocols, but you're safe, and that's what matters. Peter sighed with relief, but Tony didn't let him relax. But that doesn't mean Pepper isn't. Now everyone thinks Spider-Man is my son, and Pepper is going to be the one to deal with that PR mess. Get ready for at least 3 press conferences, Tony threatened with a smile. Peter just wanted to bury his face in his pillow. Come to think of it, it's not so bad. Pepper already wanted you to be the new CEO and heir to Stark Industries. Now all that's left is to ask May for joint custody and formally adopt you. Tony considered seriously. Peter quickly said goodbye and hung up the phone. He put his phone on Do Not Disturb and got back into bed. He would deal with the problems later. Now he was going to sleep. Thank you for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this work. Have a lovely rest of your day.